When we talk about the deployment of U.S. ground troops, we are not just discussing a tactical decision. We are talking about a fundamental shift in the nature of conflict itself, because there is a very real difference between applying pressure from a distance and physically placing soldiers on the ground. That difference is not just military. It is psychological, political, and strategic. Up to a certain point, states can operate in a space of deterrence. They can signal intent, apply pressure, and manage escalation without fully committing to direct confrontation. That's the space where diplomacy, intelligence, air power, and proxy influence tend to dominate. It's controlled, even if it's tense, but the moment ground troops are deployed, that space begins to collapse. And that collapse matters because the presence of ground forces sends a very clear signal. This is no longer a limited engagement. This is a commitment. And once that signal is sent, it changes how every actor in the system behaves. Allies reassess, adversaries recalibrate. Regional powers start positioning themselves differently. The entire strategic environment shifts from something that can be managed at a distance to something that is now unfolding in real time on the ground with direct human consequences. This is where the psychological dimension becomes critical. Ground troops introduce visibility in a way that other forms of power do not. Missiles, drones, cyber operations, these can be precise, impactful, and even decisive, but they don't carry the same level of human immediacy. Ground troops do. Every decision becomes visible. Every casualty becomes politically significant. Every movement carries weight because it is tied to human presence, not just technological capability. And that visibility feeds directly into domestic politics because when a country deploys troops, it doesn't just engage externally, it also engages internally. Public opinion begins to matter in a different way. Questions start to emerge. What are we trying to achieve? How long will this last? What is the cost? And crucially, is it worth it? These are not abstract questions. They are deeply personal because they involve risk to soldiers, risk to national resources, and risk to political stability. And over time, those questions can become just as important as the military objectives themselves. But there is another layer here that often gets overlooked. Ground troops don't just change how a conflict is perceived, they change how it evolves. Because once you commit forces on the ground, you also commit to sustaining them. That means logistics, supply lines, intelligence, coordination, and constant adaptation to a dynamic environment. You are no longer observing the battlefield. You are part of it. And that involvement creates a feedback loop. Every action has a reaction. Every advance creates new vulnerabilities. Every success can generate new resistance. And over time, that dynamic can become self-reinforcing. What begins as a clear objective can gradually turn into a more complex, open-ended engagement where the definition of success becomes harder to pin down. This is where the risk of escalation becomes particularly important, because ground troops can act as a trigger point. Their presence can draw responses that would not otherwise occur. Local actors may escalate their own involvement. External actors may feel compelled to respond. And what started as a limited intervention can begin to expand in ways that are difficult to fully control. Now, from a purely strategic perspective, this is not necessarily a failure. There are situations where ground forces are deployed and objectives are achieved, but the threshold for success is much higher. The margin for error is much smaller, and the consequences of miscalculation are significantly greater. This is why decisions about ground deployment are never just military decisions. They are political decisions shaped by strategy, but also by risk tolerance, public sentiment, and long-term vision. Because once you commit to that level of engagement, you are committing to a trajectory, and changing that trajectory later can be extremely difficult. There is also a broader philosophical point here. Power in the modern world is not just about the ability to act, it is about the ability to choose how and when to act. Ground troop deployment reduces that flexibility. It locks you into a more rigid structure of engagement. And in a complex, fast-moving geopolitical environment, flexibility is often one of the most valuable assets you can have. So the question is not simply, can ground troops achieve a military objective? The question is, at what cost, over what time frame, and with what unintended consequences? Because in today's world, conflicts are rarely isolated events. They are interconnected systems. And when you introduce ground forces into that system, you are not just adding pressure, you are changing the structure of the system itself. And that's the key insight. Ground troop deployment is not just an escalation of force. It is an escalation of commitment with consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield and often far beyond the original objective. And when ground troops enter a conflict, the nature of the fight changes in a very fundamental way. It stops being a contest defined by distance and begins to become a contest defined by proximity. And in that proximity, asymmetry becomes not just likely, it becomes inevitable. Because the reality is this: ground forces do not face a single uniform opponent. They face an environment, And that environment is often shaped by a mix of irregular actors, fragmented groups, and shifting alliances that do not operate according to conventional military logic. This is what we mean when we talk about asymmetric warfare on the ground. It's not just about weapons. It's about the structure of the conflict itself. Now, in a conventional war, the battlefield is more defined. You have front lines, you have identifiable units, you have a clearer sense of where the conflict is happening and who is involved. But once you introduce asymmetric dynamics, those lines begin to blur, the battlefield becomes fluid, the adversary becomes harder to identify, and the rules of engagement become more complex. This has profound psychological implications for soldiers on the ground, because uncertainty is one of the most difficult conditions to operate under. When you cannot clearly distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, every decision carries weight, every interaction requires judgment, and every moment introduces the possibility of miscalculation. That kind of environment creates what we might call constant cognitive load. Soldiers are not just physically operating in a conflict zone, they are mentally processing risk at every step. That has implications for decision-making, for cohesion, and for long-term effectiveness. Over time, that level of sustained pressure can take a significant toll. But the challenge doesn't end there. Asymmetric warfare often involves tactics that are specifically designed to offset the strengths of a more powerful force. That means instead of meeting directly on the battlefield, opposing actors may rely on indirect methods, ambushes, improvised explosive devices, hit-and-run tactics, and the strategic use of terrain and civilian environments. And this is where the environment itself becomes part of the strategy. Urban areas in particular introduce an entirely different layer of complexity. Cities are dense, they are layered, they are filled with infrastructure, people, and movement. And in that environment, distinguishing between threat and non-threat becomes significantly more difficult. Every structure can conceal risk. Every street can become contested space. And every operation carries potential consequences that extend beyond the immediate objective. This creates a situation where military success cannot be measured purely in territorial terms, because even when territory is secured, the underlying dynamics of the conflict may remain unchanged. The resistance doesn't necessarily disappear. It adapts, it disperses, it reorganizes, and it continues in a different form. That adaptability is one of the defining features of asymmetric conflict. It is not static, it evolves, and it does so in response to pressure. From a strategic perspective, that means ground forces are often engaged in a continuous cycle of adaptation themselves. Tactics must evolve, intelligence must be updated, and operations must be constantly recalibrated. It's not a single move, it's an ongoing process of adjustment. But there's another dimension that is just as important, and that is the moral and political context in which these operations take place. Because asymmetric warfare, especially in populated areas, often brings military forces into contact with civilian populations. And that introduces a set of ethical considerations that are incredibly difficult to navigate. The need to protect civilians, to minimize collateral damage, and to maintain legitimacy becomes central to the operation. And here's where the philosophical tension emerges. In asymmetric warfare, the distinction between military and political objectives becomes blurred. Every action has a message. Every outcome carries narrative weight. And perceptions, both local and global, become as important as tactical success. That means ground troops are not just operating in a physical space. They are operating in a psychological and informational space as well. Their actions are being observed, interpreted, and sometimes amplified in ways that can influence the broader conflict. This is where the idea of legitimacy becomes critical. Because in asymmetric conflicts, legitimacy is not just about legal justification, it's about perception. It's about whether actions are seen as necessary, proportional, and aligned with broader goals. And once legitimacy is questioned, the strategic environment becomes even more complex. Adversaries in asymmetric warfare often understand this dynamic very well. They may not need to win militarily in the traditional sense. Instead, they can aim to prolong the conflict, increase costs, and influence perception. And in doing so, they can shift the strategic balance without ever engaging in direct confrontation. So what you end up with is a conflict that is not defined by decisive battles, but by endurance. Not by clear victories, but by incremental shifts, and not by control of territory alone, but by control of narrative, perception, and momentum. And that brings us back to the central challenge. Ground troops operating in asymmetric environments are not just fighting an enemy. They are navigating a system that is designed to resist, adapt, and persist. That system tests not only military capability, but also political will, strategic clarity, and societal resilience. Because in the end, asymmetric warfare is not just about how conflicts are fought. It is about how long you are willing and able to stay in them while adapting to an opponent who is always changing the terms of engagement. And that is where the real test begins. When ground troops enter a conflict, the effects rarely stay contained within the immediate battlefield. In today's interconnected world, conflict has a way of radiating outward. It moves across borders, it influences markets, and it pulls in actors who were not initially part of the equation. And that's where the third layer becomes critical, the regional and global consequences of deployment. Because the moment a major power commits ground forces, the conflict is no longer just a local issue. It becomes a regional signal and often a global event. Let's start with the regional dimension. In many of today's conflict zones, there are multiple actors with overlapping interests, alliances, and historical grievances. When ground troops are deployed, those actors begin to reassess their positions. Some may see an opportunity to advance their own objectives. Others may feel threatened and respond defensively, and still others may attempt to remain neutral. But neutrality in these environments is rarely stable. This creates what we might call a chain reaction dynamic. One decision triggers another, which triggers another, and so on. What begins as a bilateral engagement can quickly expand into a multi-actor environment. And once that happens, the complexity increases exponentially. From a strategic perspective, that's a very different challenge. Because instead of dealing with a single opponent, you are now navigating a network of actors, each with their own goals, constraints, and red lines. Coordination becomes more difficult, predictability decreases, and the risk of miscalculation increases. But the consequences are not just political or military, they are also economic, because modern conflicts do not exist in isolation from global systems. Energy markets, supply chains, financial systems, these are all interconnected, and when instability rises in one region, it often reverberates across the global economy. For example, if a conflict disrupts a key shipping route, that can impact global trade flows. If tensions escalate in an energy-producing region, that can affect oil and gas prices worldwide, and if uncertainty increases, markets tend to react quickly, sometimes more quickly than policymakers can respond. And that's important because markets don't just reflect reality, they also shape it. Rising prices can lead to inflationary pressures. Supply disruptions can affect production across industries, and increased uncertainty can influence investment decisions, both public and private. So, when we talk about the global consequences of deploying ground troops, we are not just talking about military outcomes. We are talking about systemic effects that ripple through multiple layers of the international order. There is also a geopolitical dimension to consider, because when a major power deploys ground forces, it sends a signal not just to the immediate adversary, but to the world. It raises questions. What are the objectives? How long will this last? How far is the commitment? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for the broader balance of power? Other global actors will be watching closely. Some may adjust their own strategies in response. Others may seek to exploit perceived openings. And still others may become more cautious, recalibrating their approach to avoid unintended escalation. This creates a kind of strategic feedback loop at the international level. Actions taken in one region influence perceptions and behaviors in others, and over time, this can reshape the broader geopolitical landscape. But there is another layer that is often underestimated, and that is the psychological effect on global systems. Because when conflict becomes more intense, more visible, and more sustained, it changes the baseline expectations of stability. What once seemed stable may begin to feel uncertain. What once felt predictable may start to appear fragile, and that shift in perception matters, because expectations drive behavior. If actors believe that the global environment is becoming more volatile, they will act differently. They may hedge their risks. They may diversify their strategies. They may become more cautious or in some cases more aggressive. And so in that sense, the deployment of ground troops does not just affect the conflict itself. It influences how the world thinks about conflict more broadly. And that brings us to a deeper philosophical point. In an interconnected world, no conflict is truly isolated. Every action has consequences that extend beyond its immediate context, and those consequences are not always linear. They are often indirect, delayed, and difficult to predict. That means decision-making in this environment requires a different kind of thinking. It requires an understanding of systems, not just events. It requires an awareness of second-order and third-order effects. And it requires a willingness to think beyond the immediate moment. Because what may seem like a contained decision today can become a global issue tomorrow. And once that happens, the scope of responsibility changes. So when we look at the potential deployment of ground troops, we are not just evaluating a military option. We are evaluating a decision that has the potential to reshape regional dynamics, disrupt global systems, and influence the behavior of multiple actors across the international landscape. And that is the core of the challenge. Because in a world that is deeply interconnected, the impact of a single decision can extend far beyond where it begins. And the question we are left with is this. So are we prepared to manage not just the immediate consequences of action, but the global ripple effects that follow? When we talk about the deployment of ground troops, we often focus on the battlefield, on strategy, on regional dynamics. But there is another front that is just as important and in many ways even more narrow, domestic political pressure, because no matter how a conflict begins, it ultimately has to be sustained by political will at home. And that is where many military engagements are ultimately decided. Ground troops change the political equation in a very direct way. They make the costs of conflict visible in a way that distant operations do not. When a nation commits soldiers on the ground, those soldiers become the most tangible representation of that conflict for the public. Every casualty, every injury, every return home carries weight, not just for families, but for the national conversation as a whole. And that matters because public opinion is not static. It evolves over time. It reacts to developments on the ground. It responds to perceived progress or the lack of it. And as a conflict continues, the question that begins to emerge is not just, are we winning? But at what cost? This is where political leadership faces one of its most difficult challenges, because sustaining a military engagement is not just about maintaining operational effectiveness, it's about maintaining public support. And those two things are not always aligned. At the beginning of a deployment, there is often a degree of support, sometimes even unity. There is a sense of purpose, a belief that action is necessary. But as time goes on, that initial momentum can begin to shift. Costs become more visible. Objectives may seem less clear, and the distance between intention and outcome can start to feel wider. This is where the psychology of time becomes critical, because public patience is not infinite, and prolonged engagements tend to test that patience in very real ways. Economic factors come into play: defense spending, resource allocation, and the opportunity costs of sustained military operations. These are not abstract numbers. They affect domestic priorities, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and they shape the broader economic narrative. And at the same time, political divisions can deepen. Different groups may interpret the same conflict in very different ways. Some may see it as necessary and justified. Others may question its purpose or its execution. And over time, those differences can become more pronounced, influencing not just public discourse, but also electoral dynamics and leadership decisions. There's also a historical dimension that leaders cannot ignore. Ground wars, particularly prolonged ones, have a way of shaping political legacies. They can define presidencies. They can influence elections, and they can alter the trajectory of political institutions themselves. Because once a country is deeply engaged in a ground conflict, it becomes much harder to disengage. The political cost of withdrawal must be weighed against the cost of continuation, and that creates a kind of strategic dilemma. Do you continue to pursue your objectives at increasing cost, or do you adjust course and risk the perception of retreat? There is no easy answer to that question. And that is precisely why ground deployments are among the most consequential decisions a government can make. But beyond the immediate political considerations, there is a deeper philosophical issue at play. Ground troop deployment forces a society to confront the relationship between power and responsibility. It raises questions about the limits of military force, the obligations of leadership, and the expectations of the public, because in a democratic system, military action is ultimately accountable to the people. And that accountability introduces a level of scrutiny that shapes every stage of the engagement, from the initial decision to deploy, to the strategy on the ground, to the eventual outcome. So that scrutiny is not a weakness. In fact, it is one of the defining features of democratic governance, but it does mean that military strategy cannot be separated from political reality. The two are deeply interconnected. And that brings us to a key insight. The sustainability of a military operation is not just determined by what happens on the battlefield. It is determined by what happens at home. Because if public support erodes, if political consensus fractures, if economic pressures intensify, then even the most strategically sound operation can become difficult to sustain. And over time, that can lead to shifts in policy, adjustments in strategy, or in some cases, a complete reevaluation of objectives. This is where the concept of strategic clarity becomes essential. Leaders must not only define their objectives, they must communicate them clearly, consistently, and in a way that resonates with the public. Because without that clarity, it becomes difficult to maintain support over time. And in the absence of support, even the most powerful military forces face limitations. So when we think about the deployment of ground troops, we need to think beyond the battlefield. We need to think about the home front. We need to think about the political environment. And we need to think about the long-term implications of sustained engagement. Because ultimately, wars are not just fought with weapons, they are sustained by will. And when that will begins to change, everything else follows. So the question we are left with is not just whether a ground deployment is possible. The real question is whether it can be sustained politically, economically, and socially long enough to achieve its intended purpose. And that is a question every leader must answer before the first step is taken.